The following content is a narrated account intended for storytelling and discussion.
Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. When Eric Blake inherited his aunt's peaceful lakeside property, he thought he'd found the perfect escape from city life. But tranquility turned to turmoil when the local HOA declared war over his shoreline. What began as quiet resistance spiraled into a battle of rights, legacy, and one man's unshakable resolve. Eric Blake had always been drawn to the serenity of Vermont. When his Aunt Ellen passed away and left him her beloved lakeside property, it felt like fate had given him a chance to escape the relentless pace of city life. The house, perched on a gently sloping hill overlooking the tranquil waters of Lake Harmon, was more than just a home. It was a symbol of his family's legacy. 5 acres of private land surrounded by dense, whispering trees, and the sparkling shoreline provided a sanctuary that had been in his family for decades. For Eric, a 40-year-old software engineer accustomed to endless hours in front of glowing screens, the transition was welcome. The prospect of working remotely from a home office with an unobstructed view of the lake, coupled with the chance to reclaim his roots, was too good to pass up. The property was rich in memories, summers spent fishing, skipping stones, and listening to Aunt Ellen's stories about the house's history. Her insistence on keeping the land independent from any neighborhood associations now seemed prescient, a testament to her fierce belief in autonomy. The first few months were blissful. Eric spent his mornings sipping coffee on the wraparound porch and his afternoons refurbishing the dock and trimming overgrown hedges. He reveled in the isolation, finally free from the constant hum of urban life. He greeted the occasional neighbors with friendly nods and polite conversation, though he largely kept to himself. He hadn't even met most of the residents of Harmon Hills, the upscale community on the other side of the wooded boundary. But Eric's peace was short-lived. It started subtly. An unfamiliar car parked near his driveway, its occupants wandering down to the shoreline. He dismissed it as a mistake, perhaps tourists confused about public access. Then came the laughter of children playing near his dock, their footprints leaving trails in the mud. Politeness dictated that he approached them gently, informing the parents that this was private property. To his surprise, the families didn't apologize. Instead, they casually dismissed his concerns with comments like, "Oh, everyone in Harmon Hills has always used this spot," or "It's just a little beach fun. It's no big deal." The turning point came on a breezy afternoon in early summer when a confident, middle-aged woman with a clipboard strolled onto Eric's porch uninvited. She introduced herself as Carla Johnson, the president of the Harmon Hills Homeowners Association. Flanked by 2 others she introduced as board members, Carla spoke with an air of authority that bordered on condescension. "Welcome to the neighborhood, Mr. Blake," she began, her smile as practiced as a politician's. "We wanted to formally introduce ourselves and discuss the wonderful opportunities that come with being part of the Harmon Hills HOA. Since your property is adjacent to our community and has been historically accessible to our residents, it makes sense for us to formalize the relationship." Eric's brow furrowed. "I appreciate the introduction, but this property has always been private. My aunt kept it that way intentionally." Carla's smile stiffened. "Of course. But given the long-standing use of your shoreline by our community, joining the HOA would only solidify the mutual benefits. It's really in everyone's best interest." Her words were polished, but the implication was clear. Compliance was expected. Eric's tone hardened as he reiterated that he had no interest in joining the HOA or granting any rights to his property. The exchange ended with Carla's lips pressed into a thin, forced smile as she issued her parting remark. "I hope you'll reconsider." It would be a shame if things became complicated. As the trio departed, Eric stood on the porch, unsettled. The calm he had cherished was starting to ripple, much like the lake under an unexpected breeze. Something told him that Carla and her HOA weren't going to take no for an answer. The days following Carla Johnson's unwelcome visit marked the beginning of an unsettling shift in Eric's tranquil life. At first, he tried to dismiss the encounter as a misunderstanding, hoping the HOA president would simply accept his firm refusal. But Carla's thinly veiled threat lingered in his mind, and it wasn't long before her promises of complications began to materialize. It started innocuously enough, A letter slipped into his mailbox on crisp HOA branded stationery. The letter, signed by Carla herself, contained a politely worded request for Eric to reconsider his stance. It extolled the community spirit of Harmon Hills and reiterated the supposed historical use of his shoreline by local residents. Eric skimmed the letter and set it aside, viewing it as nothing more than a weak attempt to sway him. But when a second letter arrived the following week, this one more pointed, mentioning prescriptive easements and rights of access, Eric felt the first pang of unease. His discomfort grew when the trespassing escalated. Despite the private property signs he had erected along the edge of the shoreline, groups of people continued to show up. Families with coolers and beach chairs planted themselves on the grass near his dock as if it were a public park. Kayakers dragged their boats across his yard, leaving ruts in the damp earth. Each time Eric approached them, the responses grew bolder. "Oh, we've always done this," one man exclaimed, unfazed. "Charles led us. Why should it be any different now?" When Eric explained yet again that his late aunt had never authorized public access, the man scoffed. "You're just being difficult. This is about community." A few days later, things took an even more invasive turn. Returning from a trip to town, Eric found a group of children jumping off his dock, their parents chatting idly on his lawn. The sight of the dock creaking under the weight of so many feet made his heart lurch. When he confronted the parents, one of them, a brash woman in oversized sunglasses, rolled her eyes and snapped, "Relax, we're not hurting anything. You don't own the lake." Frustration turned to anger when Eric discovered that his signs had been torn down. A new wave of intrusions followed, with strangers openly disregarding his presence and muttering about his selfishness when he asked them to leave. The final straw came when he caught sight of Carla herself, standing at the edge of his dock with a clipboard, giving directions to a group of neighbors as if she were orchestrating a community event. Furious, Eric called a meeting with his attorney, Mary Goodman. A no-nonsense woman with a sharp mind and years of experience in property law, Mary listened intently as Eric described the growing tension. When he mentioned the letters and Carla's vague legal jargon, Mary's lips curled into a frown. "They're trying to intimidate you," she said flatly, flipping through the file of documents Eric had brought. "Prescriptive easements? Historical use? Nonsense. Your aunt was meticulous about keeping this property independent. I'll look into the county records, but I'm confident they don't have a leg to stand on." Mary wasted no time drafting a formal cease and desist letter, laying out the legal ramifications of trespassing and clarifying that Eric's property was not, and had never been, subject to HOA rules. The letter was direct, almost brutally so, and Eric felt a measure of relief when he mailed it off the following day. But Carla and the HOA were far from done. Within a week, Eric began receiving phone calls from unknown numbers, each one a neighbor either pleading for him to be reasonable or berating him for being uncooperative. The Harmon Hills newsletter featured a thinly veiled editorial about the responsibilities of good neighbors, accompanied by a photograph of the lake, Eric's shoreline prominently featured. And then came the organized gathering. One Saturday morning, Eric woke to the sound of laughter and splashing. He stepped onto his porch to see more than 20 people spread across his lawn, setting up umbrellas and unloading kayaks. Carla was at the center of it all, clipboard in hand, as if presiding over an HOA-sponsored event. Fury boiled over as Eric stormed down to confront her. "This is private property," he shouted over the noise. "You have no right to be here." Carla turned with a serene smile that only deepened his anger. "Eric, we're simply continuing what's been tradition here for years. You can't stop progress." Eric clenched his fists. He didn't want to escalate the situation, but it was clear that reasoning with Carla was futile. He needed a stronger response, one that would force the HOA to understand that this was his land, and he wasn't going to be bullied into submission. The gathering on Eric's property was a breaking point. Watching strangers trample his lawn, splash in his lake, and behave as though they had every right to be there, filled him with a frustration that bordered on fury. Carla's smug demeanor, her clipboard clutched like a scepter of authority, only added fuel to the fire. Eric knew this was no longer just an issue of miscommunication. It was a blatant disregard for his rights. Without hesitation, he called the local police. As he waited for officers to arrive, he confronted Carla directly, his voice calm but laced with anger. "You've gone too far, Carla. This is private property. I've been more than patient, but this ends now." Carla raised an eyebrow, her serene smile never faltering. "Eric, you can't stop the community from accessing what they've always used. This is bigger than you. It's about preserving tradition and ensuring everyone has access to the lake." Eric took a step closer, lowering his voice. "You're trespassing, and if you don't leave immediately, you'll be dealing with more than just me. You'll be dealing with the law." Before Carla could respond, the sound of a police cruiser approaching cut through the chatter. The officers stepped out, their expressions neutral as Eric explained the situation. He pointed to the signs that had been torn down and the dozens of people still lounging on his property. Carla attempted to interject, launching into a rehearsed explanation of community use and historical precedent. But the officers weren't swayed. "This is private property," one officer said firmly after reviewing Eric's deed and the boundary markers. "You and your group need to leave now. Failure to comply will result in citations for trespassing." The crowd began to disperse reluctantly, muttering complaints and shooting Eric dirty looks as they packed up their belongings. Carla, however, lingered, her expression hardening as she stood her ground. "You may have won today," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "But this isn't over." Eric watched her retreat, her heels crunching angrily on the gravel driveway. His relief was short-lived. That same afternoon, he received an email from the HOA's legal representative, citing dubious claims of prescriptive easement and threatening legal action if Eric did not grant the association formal access to his shoreline. The letter was filled with convoluted legal jargon, but its intent was clear. They were preparing for a fight. Eric forwarded the email to Mary Goodman, who responded within the hour, her tone as sharp and resolute as ever. "They're bluffing," she assured him during a phone call. "They're trying to scare you into compliance because they know their claims won't hold up in court. But if they want to take this to the next level, we'll be ready." Mary moved swiftly. She filed an injunction to bar HOA members from accessing Eric's property under any circumstances and formally notified them that further trespassing or harassment would lead to immediate legal consequences. She also began gathering evidence to counter the HOA's claims, pulling property records, old photographs, and even county filings submitted by Eric's aunt over the years that explicitly outlined the property's independence from any community agreements. Meanwhile, Eric's frustration turned to resolve. He upgraded his security system, adding cameras with live feeds to cover every angle of the property. He printed copies of his deed and survey to keep on hand for any future confrontations. He even began documenting the actions of HOA members, noting every instance of trespassing, harassment, or property damage. The final confrontation came a week later during a surprise HOA meeting that Carla had orchestrated. Eric arrived uninvited, armed with Mary and a folder brimming with documentation. The meeting was packed with residents, many of whom glared at Eric as he took a seat. Carla wasted no time launching into a tirade, painting Eric as a selfish outsider disrupting the harmony of their community. Mary let her speak, her expression impassive. When Carla finally finished, Mary stood commanding the room's attention with her composed authority. "My client's property rights are not up for negotiation," she began, her voice steady but firm. "Any claims of prescriptive easement are invalid, as we can clearly demonstrate through decades of legal filings. Furthermore, the repeated trespassing and harassment directed at my client constitute serious legal violations. If this behavior continues, we will not hesitate to pursue damages." She laid out the evidence, surveys, photographs, and even video footage of the recent gathering. The room fell silent as Carla's carefully constructed narrative unraveled. Residents who had initially supported her began exchanging uneasy glances, realizing the extent of her overreach. By the end of the meeting, Carla's confidence had crumbled. As Eric and Mary left, he felt the weight of the conflict finally beginning to lift. The tide was turning, but he knew the fight wasn't over yet. The aftermath of the HOA meeting was swift and decisive. Mary's presentation had done more than just dismantle Carla's argument. It had exposed the HOA's actions as both unethical and legally indefensible. Within days, the judge granted an injunction that barred all members of the HOA, including Carla, from setting foot on Eric's property. Trespassing was now explicitly forbidden, and any violation would result in fines or legal action. The legal tide continued to turn in Eric's favor when the HOA's lawyer, likely realizing the weak foundation of their claims, reached out with a settlement proposal. They offered to drop all attempts to claim access to Eric's property in exchange for him withdrawing the injunction. But Mary wasn't interested in half measures. She countered with a much firmer proposal. The HOA would pay for damages, cover all legal fees, and sign a binding agreement that permanently acknowledged Eric's absolute ownership of the property and renounced any future claims of access. At first, the HOA resisted. Carla, still clinging to her role as president, rallied a few staunch supporters in an attempt to push back against the terms. However, the mounting costs of the legal battle and Mary's clear threat of pursuing further action for harassment and property damage brought the board to its senses. Faced with escalating pressure from both the courts and the residents, tired of footing the bill for Carla's crusade, the HOA capitulated. The final settlement was a victory in every sense. The HOA agreed to pay over $70,000 in damages and legal fees. More importantly, they signed the binding agreement Mary had drafted, ensuring that Eric's property rights were now protected beyond any doubt. Additionally, the HOA was required to notify all its members that Eric's property was private and that trespassing would result in immediate legal consequences. For Carla, the fallout was devastating. At the next HOA meeting, a vote was held to remove her from the presidency. Residents, frustrated by her recklessness and the financial burden her actions had placed on the community, voted overwhelmingly in favor of her resignation. Carla stepped down in disgrace, her influence in Harmon Hills effectively destroyed. With the legal battle finally resolved, Eric took steps to restore his property. He had a professional fence installed along the perimeter, upgraded his security system, and replaced the signs that had been torn down. His shoreline, once overrun by strangers, was now peaceful again. For the first time in months, Eric felt the tension in his shoulders begin to ease as he stood on his porch, looking out over the lake. The water was calm, the trees swayed gently in the breeze, and his home felt like a sanctuary once more. The resolution of the legal battle brought more than just peace to Eric's property. It triggered a ripple effect across Harmon Hills. With Carla no longer at the helm, the HOA underwent a dramatic transformation. The new board, composed of more reasonable and level-headed residents, made it their mission to rebuild trust within the community. Their first act was to issue a public apology to Eric, acknowledging the overreach of the previous administration and promising to respect his rights moving forward. Eric, though wary at first, accepted the apology with grace. To his surprise, several neighbors approached him individually to express their regret. One couple, David and Susan Whitaker, even stopped by with a bottle of wine. "We didn't realize the extent of Carla's actions," Susan admitted, her tone genuinely apologetic. "We're sorry for the way things played out." These gestures, though small, helped thaw the tension that had built up over months. Eric began to notice a shift in the way neighbors treated him. Where there had once been scowls and whispers, there were now polite waves and friendly nods. The hostility that Carla had fueled was fading, replaced by a cautious but growing sense of goodwill. For Eric, the most rewarding change was the opportunity to reconnect with the property itself. Free from the constant anxiety of trespassers and legal threats, he poured his energy into restoring the land. He planted new flowers along the shoreline, repaired the dock, and installed solar-powered lighting along the fence line. Every improvement felt like reclaiming a part of the sanctuary his Aunt Ellen had cherished. The property's transformation didn't go unnoticed. A few neighbors even stopped by to compliment Eric on the improvements. The most surprising visit came from Carla herself. Months after stepping down as HOA president, she appeared at Eric's gate, looking noticeably humbled. "I wanted to apologize," she said, her voice subdued. "I let my position go to my head, and I didn't listen when I should have. I'm sorry for all the trouble I caused." Eric studied her for a moment, debating whether to accept the apology. Ultimately, he chose to extend an olive branch. "Thank you for saying that," he replied. "It's never too late to do the right thing." Carla nodded, and though she left without lingering, her visit felt like the closing of a chapter. Meanwhile, Harmon Hills itself began to change. Under the leadership of the new board, the HOA shifted its focus from rigid enforcement to fostering community spirit. They organized block parties, started a community garden, and even created a volunteer program to help elderly or disabled residents with home maintenance. The neighborhood, once fractured by petty disputes and power plays, began to heal. Eric, though still maintaining his independence, found himself more integrated into the community than he ever expected. He attended a summer barbecue hosted by the Whitakers, where he met other residents who shared stories about how Carla's departure had improved their lives. Some of them even thanked Eric for standing his ground, saying it had inspired them to speak up about their own grievances with the HOA. The most significant change came when Eric hosted a gathering of his own. On a crisp autumn afternoon, he invited family and a few new friends from Harmon Hills to a small party by the lake. They grilled burgers, played yard games, and watched the sunset paint the water in shades of gold and crimson. As Eric looked around, he felt a profound sense of fulfillment. The property, once a battleground, was now a place of joy and connection. The experience left him with a deeper understanding of what it meant to protect not just land, but principles. Eric had fought to preserve his aunt's legacy, but in doing so, he had also contributed to the growth and betterment of an entire community. For the first time in years, he felt truly at home, not just on the property, but among the people who lived around it. As the crisp autumn air settled over Vermont, Eric Blake found himself reflecting on the transformative journey he had undertaken since inheriting his aunt's lakeside property. Standing on the porch, a mug of steaming coffee in hand, he gazed out at the tranquil waters of Lake Harmon. The once contentious shoreline was now quiet and pristine, a perfect reflection of the peaceful life he had reclaimed. The battle with the HOA had been exhausting, but it had also been a revelation. Eric had learned the true value of standing his ground, not just for the sake of his property, but for the principles his Aunt Ellen had instilled in him. Her meticulous records and unwavering independence had laid the foundation for his victory, reminding him that protecting what matters often requires more than quiet resolve. It demands action. The legal win had reshaped his relationship with the community. What began as a fight for his rights had turned into a catalyst for change within Harmon Hills. The once overbearing HOA had reformed its policies, shifting its focus from enforcing arbitrary rules to fostering a supportive and inclusive neighborhood. Eric's stand had inspired others to question the status quo, and in doing so, it had strengthened the very community that had once opposed him. But for Eric, the greatest victory was personal. The property had become a sanctuary once again, a place where he could honor his family's legacy while building a life of his own. He thought back to the small gathering he'd hosted by the lake, the laughter of friends and family mingling with the rustling of leaves. It was a moment that perfectly encapsulated what this place had always meant: connection, reflection, and joy. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden glow across the water, Eric smiled to himself. He had not only preserved the land, but had also redefined its role in the lives of those around him. The property's boundaries remained intact on paper, but in the ways that truly mattered, they had dissolved. Eric now felt more connected to the people and the place than ever before. His aunt's words came to mind. This land is worth protecting, not just for what it is, but for what it represents. Eric had come to understand those words deeply. Protecting the property had been about more than holding on to a piece of land. It had been about standing firm for his values and the legacy of a family that had always believed in independence, kindness, and resilience. With a final glance at the peaceful scene before him, Eric turned back toward the warmth of his home. The fight was over, but the memories and lessons it brought would stay with him forever. In protecting his inheritance, he had found something even greater, a renewed sense of purpose and belonging in the place he now called home.